What if the greatest threat to Christianity today is not open persecution, but a deception so subtle, so convincing, that millions embrace it freely while still believing they are following God? Imagine a slow shift in which truth is replaced by comfort, holiness is exchanged for convenience, and salvation itself is redefined in a way that barely feels like a loss. Most people would not even notice when it begins, because it would not arrive as something violent or obvious, but as something reasonable, even helpful. That is what makes this question so serious, because it suggests that the danger is not outside the church alone, but something that can quietly grow with human thinking itself. This concern is closely tied to long-standing theological discussions about apostasy, the Antichrist, and the final trial of the church. These are no longer treated as distant or abstract ideas reserved for academic debate. Instead, many people are beginning to revisit them as they observe increasing moral confusion, weakening religious conviction, and a growing belief that humanity can solve its deepest problems without God. In this context, faith is not always rejected directly. More often, it is slowly reinterpreted until it loses its original meaning. A key reference in this discussion is paragraph 675 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which speaks about a final trial that will shake the faith of many believers before the return of Christ. This is not presented as a dramatic myth, but as a warning about a real spiritual crisis in which confusion and deception become widespread. The idea of apostasy is explained here not as a sudden collapse of belief, but as a gradual turning away from authentic Christianity. It is a slow process of falling away from truth, often without people realizing the full extent of the change. What makes this concept particularly unsettling is how it connects ancient warnings with modern realities. The discussion does not simply point to increasing immorality in society, but to something deeper: the rise of alternative solutions to human suffering that appear attractive on the surface. These solutions often promise peace, equality, progress, or safety, but they subtly require a shift away from divine truth as the foundation of life. In this framework, ideologies such as communism, socialism, and certain forms of modern secular thought are examined not only as political systems, but also as spiritual forces. The concern raised is not merely about governance or economics, but about the idea that human beings can construct a kind of paradise on earth through systems alone without repentance, grace, or reference to God. On the surface, these ideologies can appear compassionate, even moral, but the underlying issue is whether they replace God at the center of human hope. This is where the conversation begins to move into a more psychological dimension. It suggests that the most effective form of deception is not one that directly denies truth, but one that gradually reshapes how people understand truth itself. Over time, what was once considered objective and sacred begins to be treated as flexible, subjective, or dependent on personal interpretation. In that shift, the foundation of belief becomes unstable, and faith is no longer anchored in something beyond the self, but in human opinion and changing culture. Once truth is no longer understood as something objective and given by God, it becomes increasingly shaped by personal experience and collective agreement. What one person calls right, another may redefine as wrong, and both may feel justified in doing so. Over time, this leads to a condition where moral clarity weakens, because there is no longer a fixed reference point outside human perception. In such a climate, morality does not disappear instantly, but it becomes fluid, adjusted to circumstances, emotions, and social pressure. This shift is often described as relativism, where truth is no longer discovered but created. In this view, individuals begin to see themselves as the final authority on meaning and ethics. The consequence is not always immediate chaos, but a slow internal collapse of shared certainty. People may still use religious language, but the meaning behind that language gradually changes depending on personal interpretation rather than divine revelation. At the same time, the discussion does not ignore a more complex reality unfolding in parallel. While many people continue moving towards secular thinking, there is also a noticeable counter-movement, especially among younger generations. Instead of fully rejecting spirituality, some are turning away from modern, simplified expressions of faith and seeking something more structured, traditional, and transcendent. This creates a kind of split in cultural direction rather than a single uniform trend. On one side, A significant number of young people are drawn towards secular ideologies, technological optimism, and material explanations of human existence. These frameworks often emphasize autonomy, progress, and self-definition. On the other side, there is a growing group that feels spiritually dissatisfied with this approach. They are not necessarily rejecting modern life, but they are searching for meaning that feels deeper, more stable, and less dependent on shifting cultural values. This search has led some to rediscover traditional forms of Christian worship. Elements such as reverence in liturgy, Gregorian chant, silence, incense, and a more structured sacramental life are increasingly seen as meaningful rather than outdated. For those experiencing spiritual emptiness in modern culture, these practices offer a sense of continuity with something older and more enduring than contemporary trends. The discussion highlights that this is not simply an aesthetic preference, but often a theological instinct. Many individuals report that they are drawn to forms of worship that emphasize mystery, discipline, and reverence, rather than constant accessibility or emotional stimulation. The argument presented is that the human soul naturally responds to order and transcendence, especially in times of cultural instability. As a result, society begins to show signs of polarization rather than uniform decline. Instead of everyone moving in the same direction, there is a visible divergence. Some embrace secular frameworks more fully, while others move toward deeper religious commitment and traditional practice. This division creates a landscape where cultural identity becomes increasingly defined by contrasting responses to the same underlying instability. In this context, some interpretations suggest that God may already be preparing certain individuals and communities for future challenges, not in an immediate or dramatic sense, but through gradual formation, spiritual strengthening, and renewed commitment to faith. The idea is that even during periods of confusion, grace continues to operate quietly, shaping people who may later serve as stabilizing forces within the church. This leads naturally into the broader theme of purification and trial. The conversation begins to frame current difficulties not only as signs of decline, but also as part of a process in which faith is tested, clarified, and strengthened. What appears as collapse in one moment may, in a longer perspective, become the groundwork for renewal. From this point, the discussion shifts into what is sometimes described as a minor chastisement, understood not as a final or total judgment, but as a period of ongoing spiritual purification already unfolding within history. This idea suggests that certain crises in society are not random or disconnected, but part of a broader process in which humanity is confronted with the consequences of drifting away from truth. Instead of viewing everything as isolated political or social events, this perspective sees a deeper moral and spiritual pattern underneath. One of the strongest claims in this interpretation is that even instability within religious leadership can be understood in this light. Some theological voices throughout history have suggested that weak or confused leadership within the church may function as a form of correction, reflecting the spiritual condition of the wider society. In this sense, internal difficulties are not interpreted as evidence that divine guidance has disappeared, but rather as a mirror showing the effects of collective spiritual decline. This leads to a sobering picture of confusion, where even those in positions of religious authority may struggle with clarity on essential teachings. However, the purpose of highlighting this is not to create despair or suspicion, but to emphasize the idea of correction rather than abandonment. The central argument is that chastisement in this framework is not meant to destroy faith, but to purify it. Suffering, therefore, is interpreted not as meaningless punishment, but as a revealing force. It exposes weaknesses that might otherwise remain hidden, forcing individuals and communities to confront spiritual realities they may have avoided. In this way, hardship is seen as a kind of diagnosis, revealing deeper conditions that require attention and change. The discussion also expands into the consequences of moral and social breakdown at a broader level. It warns that civilizations can gradually move towards self-inflicted instability through patterns of moral decay, misuse of technology, political conflict, or loss of shared ethical foundations. These developments are not presented as sudden catastrophes alone, but as outcomes that build over time when societies consistently reject moral order. Importantly, This interpretation avoids describing divine punishment as arbitrary or emotional. Instead, it is framed as the natural outcome of persistent rejection of truth and order. In other words, when human systems operate without reference to higher principles, they eventually produce instability within themselves. The emphasis is on consequence rather than sudden intervention. As the reflection continues, the focus remains on balance. While the warnings are serious, they are not meant to lead into hopelessness. Instead, they are meant to encourage awareness, responsibility, and a return to spiritual grounding. The underlying message is that even in times of correction, the purpose is ultimately restoration. This sets the stage for a deeper exploration of how religious deception is understood in Catholic eschatological thought, particularly the idea that the most dangerous forms of deception are not always openly hostile, but often appear as partial truths that slowly reshape belief from within. This is where the discussion turns more directly toward one of the most unsettling ideas in Catholic prophetic tradition, the notion of a supreme religious deception connected with the figure of the Antichrist. Rather than being understood simply as a violent opponent of Christianity, the Antichrist is described in this framework as a far more subtle reality, one that reflects humanity's deepest temptation to replace God with human authority while still retaining religious language and structure. The core concern is not an obvious rejection of faith, but a substitution of its meaning. In this view, deception becomes most effective when it does not appear anti-religious, but instead presents itself as a more advanced or improved form of spirituality. It speaks the language of peace, unity, and progress, while quietly shifting the foundation away from divine revelation toward human-centered solutions. This is closely linked to the idea of modernism, understood here as a shift in how truth itself is perceived, when truth is no longer seen as objective and given by God, but instead as something formed through personal experience or cultural consensus. The boundaries of belief become increasingly flexible. In such a framework, almost any system can present itself as valid as long as it resonates emotionally or appears socially beneficial. From this perspective, ideologies such as socialism, communism, and transhumanism are not only political or technological developments, but expressions of a deeper philosophical movement. They reflect the growing belief that humanity can solve its fundamental problems through systems, science, or collective organization alone. The promise is always improvement, less suffering, more equality, greater stability, but the underlying question is whether this progress still acknowledges dependence on God. The concern raised in this discussion is not that technology or social reform are inherently negative, but that they can gradually become substitutes for spiritual meaning. When human systems begin to occupy the place once reserved for divine truth, they start to function as replacement frameworks for salvation itself. This is what gives the concept of pseudo-messianism its significance. The idea of a false form of salvation that imitates religious fulfillment while removing its divine source. In this understanding, the Antichrist figure is not primarily defined by outward aggression, but by offering solutions that appear reasonable, compassionate, and even necessary. The danger lies precisely in the fact that such a figure would not be easily recognized as hostile. Instead, the appeal would come through promises of unity, stability, and resolution of global crises, while demanding a level of loyalty that replaces spiritual allegiance to God. At this stage, the discussion also begins to compare different theological interpretations of the end times. In Catholic thought, there is no expectation of an escape from earthly suffering before the final trials of history. Instead, the Church is understood as passing through its own form of passion, mirroring the suffering of Christ before reaching its final fulfillment. This means that hardship is not avoided, but endured with faith. The emphasis is placed on perseverance rather than escape. Believers are called to remain faithful within history, not removed from it. This fundamentally reshapes how suffering is interpreted, not as evidence of abandonment, but as participation in a larger process of purification and redemption. From here, the discussion deepens into how suffering, prophecy, and historical change are understood within Catholic eschatology as part of a single unfolding spiritual reality rather than disconnected events. The central idea is that history is not moving randomly, nor is it simply shaped by political forces alone. Instead, it is viewed as a space where spiritual struggle is constantly taking place and where human decisions either align with or resist divine order. Within this framework, prophetic language is not intended to create speculation or fear, but to encourage vigilance and perseverance. The emphasis is not on predicting exact events, but on recognizing patterns that repeat throughout history. Periods of clarity followed by confusion, renewal followed by decline, and reform followed by gradual weakening of conviction. These cycles are seen not as failures of divine guidance, but as part of the ongoing interaction between human freedom and divine providence. A key point in this discussion is the idea that apostasy is rarely sudden. More often, it develops slowly through cultural pressure, gradual compromise, and a quiet weakening of belief. Outward religious practices may continue, but interior conviction can fade over time. Language remains familiar, but meaning begins to shift, and beliefs are increasingly shaped by surrounding cultural assumptions rather than by doctrinal continuity. This is why confusion is treated as a serious spiritual condition. When clarity of truth is weakened, individuals become more dependent on personal interpretation or collective opinion. What once was received as stable teaching can be reinterpreted in multiple ways, often influenced by contemporary cultural trends. Over time, this creates fragmentation, where unity of belief is replaced by diversity of interpretation that may no longer share the same foundation. In this context, modern ideologies that emphasize human autonomy become especially significant. Systems that prioritize self-determination, technological progress, or political restructuring can begin to function as alternative sources of meaning. They offer explanations for suffering and promises of future harmony, but they do so without necessarily addressing the deeper spiritual dimension, human existence. From a Catholic perspective, the concern is not with social improvement itself, but with the idea that such improvement could ever fully replace the need for grace. When human systems are treated as sufficient on their own, they begin to occupy a role that traditionally belongs to God. This is where theological caution becomes central, because the issue is not simply what these systems do, but what they assume about human destiny. At the same time, the discussion maintains a distinction between legitimate efforts to improve society and ideological absolutism. Efforts to reduce suffering, promote justice, and build more stable communities are not rejected. Instead, they are affirmed as good as long as they remain ordered toward a higher understanding of truth. The concern arises only when these goals are treated as ultimate and self-sufficient. This distinction is essential for understanding why Catholic eschatology does not reject history, but interprets it. Human progress is not denied, but it is placed within a larger spiritual horizon. When progress is understood as participation in divine order, it remains open-ended and grounded. When it is understood as replacement for divine order, it becomes closed within itself.